Hi, everyone. Sorry for the delay. Mr. Clerk, do we have quorum?
Mr. Chair, we do have quorum.
My apologies, Madam Clerk. For those of you who did not know, James Thompson is no longer a city committee clerk, although he still works for the corporation, and you'll still cross his path from time to time. He called me before he moved, and we of course wish him best with his future endeavors and thank him for his service in the clerk's department. So our clerk tonight is Elizabeth Fawcett, and I believe she has the assistance of another committee clerk. Maybe Mr. Boulognon can elaborate on that when we go to him. I guess everyone knows why we're here. It's a special meeting of administrative policies. You'll see in the agenda the chronology. So the draft bylaw came to council in November of last year. It was deferred by council to this committee with some direction, which we will see when we get to the item. And it is our job to advise council and send it back up to them before the end of this month. That was the wording of the deferral motion. And so we need to find a way to be productive tonight to move us closer to the point where we, hopefully tonight, we can give council some direction, some advice, not direction, I guess, some advice on how we would recommend they proceed with this complex item. So that being said, I will go to Mr. Boulognon who is our city clerk, to introduce the item and to give us a little bit more detail, and then we'll have some questions for him. Or I guess we're going to the committee clerk. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, if we could just go through the approval of the agenda, we will require a motion to approve the said agenda.
This is the problem with having Zoom, and then my second monitor was moved and unplugged by my family, so now I've got to find it on here. Just give me a moment. Okay, so the usual committee rules and agenda. There's the next item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. There's only one item that I already mentioned, 7A, and we need a mover and a seconder for the agenda as published. I'm sorry, I have to figure out how to toggle back to Zoom now. Here we go. No, that's not it. Here we go. Okay, I see. Moved by Councillor Chappelle. Second by Councillor McLaren. Are there any suggested changes to the agenda? Pretty tough to do, seeing as there's only one item. So we'll call the question on the agenda. All those in favor? Opposed, and that's carried. Okay, now I got to go back to where I was. There we go. Confirmation of minutes. So this is a special meeting, so there isn't, we don't do that. There's a disclosure of pecuniary interest. Any disclosure of pecuniary interest? Seeing none. Any delegations?
No, Mr. Chair, we do not have any delegations tonight.
And then we don't get a briefing. What we get is an introduction from staff on the item, right?
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so we're at business 7A. So now we go to Mr. Clerk or Madam Clerk, whoever wants to introduce this item.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll introduce the item or reintroduce the item. Once again, we're pleased to be here. We are here to talk about the procedural bylaw and the committee bylaw. And just for some background, some context for those who are joining us for the first time, the regular review of a procedural bylaw is worthwhile and necessary to ensure it meets the legislative requirements and continues to serve council and the public openly and transparently. The current procedural bylaw was enacted in June 2010. It's been amended on 11 occasions. Staff undertook the comprehensive review of the current procedural bylaw with the intent to modernize the provisions of the bylaw for the purposes of providing greater clarity of procedural rules, at the same time increasing the effectiveness and efficiency of the meetings, recognizing that the rules should be written in plain language to help facilitate, not hinder, the business of council. So the review itself was based on best practices, guiding principles, provincial legislation, and feedback from various members of council. So we're here today to once again speak about these two bylaws. We're prepared to answer any questions that committee may have. And once again, to remind committee that a recommendation from this committee is necessary this evening in order to meet the council decision for it to come back to council next week. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll leave it. And as I said, we're pleased to answer questions. I have a number of people with me in attendance. Most of my staff is either training to become a host. I've got Janet James, the Deputy State Clerk. I've got Jenna Morley from our legal department, and Brad Joyce is also in attendance. And any of the senior staff people can answer the questions. Primarily, it will be me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. I have smoother here. Apologize for the disorganization of your chair. So, I guess questions from members of the committee to staff about the report are in order, and it's questions only. And I will remind you from time to time of the context of this interaction. Is that we're not. This isn't the decision-making body for this bylaw. The decision-making body is council. This is an opportunity for us to add clarity, advice, right, to all of our colleagues before we decide on approving this bond. So we'll go first to Councillor Bone. Questions?
Mr. Chair, and through you, just a quick question about the 6-month extended duration after a state of emergency ends. I believe it applies to a state of emergency that's issued by the city and or the province. Is that accurate?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Okay. And then I guess there was a very interesting article that was written by a former councillor, and it spoke to the kind of limits on councillors' abilities to speak, and in regards to the code of conduct as well. So is there something that I guess we need to consider there? Where is this more restrictive, or does this only prevent us, or does this only really allow us in a sense to speak in a positive manner? And I mean, I'm not even sure if this is the right venue to ask that question. I'm just trying to, because I've got a few emails about it from the public, and their concern was we'd want our councillors to be able to speak freely and not just only in flowery, buttery words in a sense. So is this something where maybe we need to have a look at that, or is this not really? I realize this review is more to modernize it for electronic meetings and to deal with sort of the state of emergency with COVID and the challenges that arose there, but it is the whole bylaw, correct?
Mr. Chair, through you to the council, that is correct. There's nothing that we've placed in the new bylaw that is more restrictive than that which is current there. The city of Kingston does promote the decorum at our meetings, and looks forward to a healthy debate with respect to all the items that come forward.
Thank you.
Okay, before we go to the next speaker, Mr. Clerk, can you just confirm, or Madam Clerk, I guess, where would a member of the public find that communication that Councillor Bohm just mentioned? Is it attached to a previous meeting of the committee, or was it attached to the council agenda? Does anyone know how a member of the public would find that letter?
Mr. Chair, I'll answer that question, and Elizabeth can jump in if she'd like. The reference that Councillor Bowen was referring to is an article that is in the WIG.
This article in the reg. I read it as an email from Councillor Rogers. Is that how the rest of you received it? No.
I saw both. Yeah.
I must confess, I don't keep up daily with what's in the WIG. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Yes, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Chair, just to add on to that, there was 3 items of correspondence that were attached to the previous agenda on the December 10th. 2 of them to deal with another item, but the one item of correspondence that you're referring to that was received from Mr. Rogers
Yes.
was included on the December 10th meeting, and that would be found on the city's website attached to the agenda from the Administrative Policies Committee meeting on December 10th.
Okay, great. And that link is on the website for administrative policies.
That is correct, Mr. Chair. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, great. Any other questions to staff about this item? Councillor McLaren.
Thank you. So this is directed again to Mr. John Bolognoni. I was one of the ones who asked that that if a councillor is out on business for the city and he's late, that he be considered as having voted in the majority so that he can call reconsideration. I'm wondering, for the purposes of determining which is the prevailing side, why it would be inappropriate to consider an absent member who shows up late to be on that side, considering that generally in most elections or most votes, if a non-vote, somebody who doesn't vote, say for an example in an election, is effectively voting for the person who wins.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, he is correct. He did bring up this particular item, and it's parliamentary procedure that in order to deal with a reconsideration, both at the current meeting or a future meeting, that you need to be on the prevailing side. That is really how the reconsideration works, not just in Kingston, but in all municipalities throughout Ontario that we researched on. So it is a matter of practice, and it's consistent with board knows with respect to reconsideration.
Yes, I believe that's what I said. So what I'm asking is, why can't it be such that somebody who didn't vote, it makes it as if they are on the prevailing side, cannot also be actually considered on the prevailing side for the issue of reconsideration?
Through Mr. Chair, to the councillor, in order to bring forward a reconsideration, you need to be at the meeting. If you're not at the meeting, there's no way to bring forward that.
Yes, I understand that. What I'm suggesting to you is that under certain circumstances that have happened, a member of council arrived late because he was on council business, directed by council to be at a particular place. As a result of that direction from council, the member arrived late, not before the end of the meeting, and with plenty of time to call reconsideration on that particular issue, but was not allowed due to these procedural rules. But the effect was that, not having been there, the effect was that essentially the prevailing side wins.
To you, Mr. Chair, I don't argue with that. That is fact. If you're not there and the prevailing side carries the day, that is the decision of the body at that time. And then in order for it to be reconsidered, you would need to not only be at the meeting, but once again, be on the prevailing side.
Yes. So I'm asking, is there any legal requirement that would prevent the line in the bylaw saying something to the effect that for determining the prevailing side, a member that is absent shall be considered as having voted on the prevailing side? It won't change anything during the actual vote, but it does increase the freedom of the entire council to be able to do that, especially when they are on council business. It strikes me as a way to actually thwart the entire will of council if one member is prevented due to being on council business from actually exercising his vote on this. So in this particular case, it seems that we're using procedure to the detriment And in this particular case, that vote did cost us a lot of extra money, to the detriment of the will of council, because the will of council is a collective thing. And if you're excluding a particular member who did not vote on the losing side, but effectively made the prevailing side happen the way it did, and not to be considered in that direction, it seems to be a perversion of procedure.
Okay, Councillor McLaren, I understand your point, and I think most of us do that were at that meeting. However, this is really straying off the topic, which is questions to staff about the report. So your disagreement with the proposed draft bylaw is noted, and the time to address that would be when this draft bylaw comes to council for decision making. And we're not doing that today. So I think it's fair to say that you have just noted one aspect of the draft bylaw that you are not in agreement with, and there may be others. But at this point, when we're asking questions, we should be focusing on getting the clarity we need to maybe identify other aspects where we may think that council may need to discuss further. So that's as far as we should really go on each individual item, because we can't settle on anything here tonight. So with that in mind, questions of comprehension about what's in the report and maybe the context of the positions that are in the report, the changes that are being proposed. There are lots of them, and I have a few questions of my own, but I don't think we should really spend too much time on any one individual thing, because we can't settle it. So the debate really goes nowhere tonight, right? And there's no point in debating, Councillor Clerk about the existence of something that's in black and white in the procedural bylaw, the draft bylaw. Right? So anyway, I see Councillor Bohm wants to ask another question, but before we go to a second round of questions, I have to make sure everyone has their chance at their first round of questions. We will come back to you, Councillor Bohm, but I see Councillor Kiley's hand at this point. Go ahead, Councillor Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to the clerk. Mr. Clerk, forgive me if I'm being a bit repetitious. I know I've asked you these questions when we've seen it before, but I think for the value of folks tuning in, maybe for the first time, or I know we have at least one other councillor here who's not on the committee, I'm hoping you could just provide a bit of the rationale for why it's recommended when it defers that motion go to council. So why doesn't committee get to look at a deferral again should these proposed changes go through?
Through Mr. Chair to the councillor, I think it's important that the council undertakes this business in an efficient and effective manner. If it chooses to leave the deferral at committee level, basically have a zombie type item that circles the drain over and over. I think our community is expecting council to make decisions and not have items stalled at standing committees for whatever reason. Short-term rental was an example of that. Our initial code of conduct was an example of that. I suspect that this review of the procedural bylaw could end up being something of that nature. So it's important that council does its business expeditiously, and I believe that, as I said, the community is looking forward to that.
Follow up to that, thank you for the explanation, and I'm sensitive and sympathetic to the rationale. I'm wondering, however, though, if it could cause actually additional work. For example, could council refer it back to committee once the deferral at committee has essentially referred it to council? Could it be a vicious cycle is what I'm wondering.
Through Mr. Chair to the councillor, it could. However, I believe that we have the practices in place where council will make decisions. As you know, committee cannot make decisions. They can only make recommendations. Ultimately, council makes the decision. So it's in council's hands. That's the place for the decision to be made.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. And then again, repeating myself from last time, but just for the benefit of those out there who haven't heard before, could you speak to the communication measures proposed, specifically when another municipality writes to the city about a particular motion they may have passed or a campaign that they're involved in, who it is that brings it to the attention of council and why that is? So
with respect to the communications, The city of Kingston itself receives a number of resolutions from other municipalities, and they may or may not be relevant to Kingston. For example, we had a resolution from Deep River with respect to the nuclear reactor technology. While we do have some other municipalities that are relevant to Kingston, they may be more appropriately referred to and reviewed in action through a standing committee rather than council. So that's why we've made that modification.
Just to be clear, it would be the CA or the mayor who would make that decision about if committee were to see it or council. Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Kiley. Anyone else that hasn't yet spoken wish to ask questions? Councillor Spell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of meetings, and I've raised them with the clerk already. The rules for debate on deferral motions is something that concerns me because we are not following Burnett's rules, which, and I would like to have an explanation of that so that people understand that typically a deferral motion, according to the rules that govern our council bylaws, is that it's time that is debated. And the recommended procedural change is that you can also extend this debate on intent or whatever. So basically you end up debating an item that really should be deferred for another day for more greater consultation with your residents. So I don't understand why we're putting in this change or who on council may have even requested this change. So
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor. To be clear, the council procedural bylaw is not intended to replicate the provisions of Bourneau. The bylaw states that Bourneau's only applies to proceedings of council not specifically governed by the provisions of the bylaw. In this case, council has established specific rules for motions to defer in the existing procedural bylaw. We have not substantively amended the proposed bylaw. We've just given it some clarity with respect to time, place, and intent. And the second point of that question was, where did this come from? It came out of a discussion that we had with a couple members of council, one being the mayor.
With regards to tonight's discussion, amending the committee bylaw to require committee deferrals to automatically go to the committee's governing body for a decision based on the council, I find this to be prohibitive in the sense that we had a very lengthy debate that the public was engaged with at multiple events, and it was the STR, short-term rentals, and we thought that we finally made progress on having a comprehensive solution, and only to have the staff recommendation we turned over when we brought it to council. But nonetheless, I think this committee in particular is one where you have some excellent councillors that can flush out and get details on motions. And I'd like to understand why you are taking that power away from this committee or other committees in that regards with respect to trying to do the work they need to do. Because sometimes, to put it bluntly, councillors are only eat what they're fed, so to speak. So if we don't have all the details, we have to ask for more details. We may need to ask for deferral, but to offer a deferral and then force it up to council doesn't really solve the issue at hand. I think sometimes this committee in particular requires more time to assess and analyze a proposal or concept or something that's coming before council. And so I strongly oppose to this amendment. I'd like to have your explanation as to why it's included.
Mr. Chair, to the councillor, I would comment that we have excellent councillors on all our committees, as well as the members of the public that serve with council on the various committees. So we'll move forward on that afterwards. So the reality with respect to the deferral is, as I've mentioned in the past, committees do not have the opportunity to or the ability to make decisions. All the standing committees and other committees can do is recommend to council. Council is the ultimate decision maker on all the information that goes forward up to council. It's important to note that that is the basis of our parliamentary procedure and a model of governance that we have here at Kingston, which is the Standing Committee Council model. At the end of the day, council makes that decision. The other point is that deferrals potentially require also direction to staff with respect to additional work that they need to do. And when it comes back to direction to staff, that really can only be provided by council, not an individual member of council, and definitely not a standing committee.
Speaking of deferrals, what about text in the bylaws for referrals, where something is referred to, say, the Administrative Policies Committee for extra work?
Well, we're talking right now about deferrals. Referrals obviously is another item, but once again, referrals back to staff to accomplish some work, once again, requires staff to get out of the work that they're doing with respect to potentially these strategic goals and focus on other matters that are being directed forth from committee. Once again, it's council that makes that decision, not committee.
And I guess one of my final questions for at this juncture, to allow my other colleagues to chime in, is I'm really concerned about the wording of posting communications from members of council on the public agenda. I'd like to have some clarity on that, because to me it seems that it'll be a suppression of conversations that we have, and I'd like to understand this a little clearer.
Through Mr. Chair, to the councillor, we had a request from a member of council who wanted to provide additional information to council before a decision is made. It was suggested that the 5 minutes would not allow for that to happen, and a place that we decided that would work would be a communication from members of council. Communications aren't debatable or anything like that, but it provides a member of council an opportunity to provide that information to council and the community. We could have been down the information report for members of council, but we didn't find that to be the most efficient way to do it. Communication is fine. And it's consistent with what other municipalities do as well.
I apologize. I'm really having a hard time hearing your response, Mr. Clerk. It was breaking up a bit.
We find that members of council submitting a communication to the clerk for inclusion in the agenda is fine. It's consistent with how other municipalities also deal with additional information to council.
Okay, if that's the case, so what you're suggesting is that if I chose to write an editorial before every council meeting with my positions, I could then submit that to council for everybody and then gets published, and I would have a more efficient way than utilizing just the Week Standard or the Kingstonianist or Facebook to get my message. Is that what you're suggesting is possible now?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the councillor, yes, that is possible. If that's where you spend your time doing your constituency work, that's fine.
Okay, I'll leave that with my questions for the moment. You got me chuckling here.
With the committees and I have a follow-up question to the last line of questioning from Councillor Schubert. So, because it's not clear from the way that it's worded. So, okay, I understand that what's being proposed is that staff can post the written communications from a member of council as supplemental information. They post it as a communication in the council package, along with the other communications. The example given was from a councillor who felt like they needed to provide more information than would have been possible with an oral submission. So I understand that part. What I don't understand is it by request only? Is it at the discretion of the clerk? Is it at the discretion of council? I don't understand when this would happen, like what the rules say about when this would happen.
Here, Mr. Chair, it could happen at each and every meeting. If, for instance, yourself, you have something that you would want to submit for council to review and consider as a communication, if it's submitted to the city clerk, just like any other communication that is submitted to me from members of the community, we would list it in the agenda or the addendum, should that be the case, and it will be received as part of the public record.
Right, but that's not actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not actually a change at all, because anyone can submit communications and have them included on the public record. Is that not correct?
Through Mr. Chair, it hasn't been our practice to allow members of council to submit communications on an agenda. We find that the council meeting is a proper place for that, and that's why we provide sufficient time for the member of council to present their position. However, if that member of council feels they either would have needed additional time or have a better way of putting their thoughts down on paper and submit it as a communication, then we will receive that. We will include it in the agenda or addendum.
Right. So, okay. So I guess what I'm hearing, please confirm, is that the past practice was to only allow council members to submit information during their oral submissions in the public council meeting and not in this fashion. And that is where the change lies in the change of practice. But it's not really a procedure change, rather an interpretation of how to receive information from members of council.
Mr. Chair, I would argue that it is the procedure change. That's why it's been included in the procedure bylaw. As I indicated previously, initially we did not allow for communications, minority reports and whatnot that they be provided by members of council in writing. This will allow for that to happen in the form of a communication, which is non-debatable.
And could a member also request that the information be presented as an information report from members of council?
We've taken the practice that it would be a communication to council. If council decides that they want to change that in the form of an information report, that's another story. Right now, the communication section in the proposed procedural bylaw would allow a member of council to submit a non-debatable communication, whether or not there's an item on the agenda, which may be useful in terms of its interpretation.
Yeah, an information report is not debatable. My question is, why could a member, not is it common practice, but could a member, without any change to the bylaw, currently request to submit an information report and have it published under that section of the agenda?
Through Mr. Chair, there currently is a section in a procedure bylaw that deals with information reports from members of council. That is specific with respect to members of council who attend conferences and want to provide a report back on that which they learned at the particular conference.
Right, so it's only for external activity or conferences and things like that. It's not, it wouldn't be for something like information that you wouldn't have time to share in your 5-minute oral submission. It can't be used for that under the current rules.
Mr. Chair, you are correct.
Right. So what this draft bylaw is proposing is that request from the member of council be granted in the form of adding it to the communications.
Mr. Chair, you are correct.
And did that happen in the anecdote that was given earlier?
No, it did not.
Okay. Does everyone understand then what that what the wording under for posting of communications from members of council actually means then? So it's adding a privilege to a council member that had previously been withheld. Okay, that's all I'll follow up I have on that item. We'll go over the second round of questions. Councillor Bowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, I actually had a previous question, but I'll do my other one first now because it's going to follow your line of reasoning. I guess with what we were just discussing, I do share a concern that giving us the ability to provide those communications ahead of time, what prevents that from becoming a debate? So for instance, some issues, I'm just going to try to frame the question in a way that, so some issues will be deferred or will span multiple council meetings, or we'll get, an update on it. And then there could be somebody that posts an opinion piece, which is basically a communication piece at this point. And then another councillor could go, well, I disagree with that. And then all of a sudden this becomes an online paper debate through this communication piece. So is there a mechanism that prevents it? Does the communication piece just have to be specific to an agenda item, or could it be basically on anything? Because I mean, we sometimes get communication pieces that are on something that we're not even talking about. Like it's just somebody goes, hey, I had an idea, here, council. So I'm concerned about the restrictions and then the fact that we could be now having this debate on paper back and forth rather than in our 5 minutes a little time on film in front of the public, right? So I mean, there's an art to this rule and it's being succinct. So I'm a little bit leery of just having us go and write, 10 paragraph or 10 page essays and use them at communication pieces and then go back and forth at each other.
You, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, I have no concerns with respect to the issue dealing with communications. Communications that are submitted by the prescribed time, with the community or the councillor, is available to be included on the agenda. Ideally, it would be something that should be related to an item that's on the agenda, but just like we provide members of the community opportunity to submit their correspondence, so we obviously will provide that same benefit to members of council.
Yeah, I understand that. I guess I just, what prevents a debate from going back and forth in those communications? Like, how are we giving consideration to that? So, for instance, one of my colleagues writes something, sends it in using that forum, and then I go, well, I disagree with that, and then I write something, and then all of a sudden you have a debate going back and forth through that mechanism. Like, I guess, is there a way to? I understand the intention is to provide greater information than a person may be able to provide within their allotted time. I just would like some type of mechanism to prevent basically an essay debate that's occurring kind of in the public. I understand that, yes, the public can access those communications, but busy people may not have the ability to read all this debate that's going on in the background if that occurs. So is there a mechanism or is there a way that we could, I guess, make it so people can't use that method of communication to debate? Like kind of on paper back and forth their opinions. It's just a concern I have, and I have a feeling it'll probably occur more often than we're considering right now. Once that becomes a mechanism that's being used. So is there something we could put into, I guess, prevent that or harness it in a sense?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, as I indicated before, I have no concern with respect to that. I think we have an educated community, we have educated members of council, and I would suspect that members of council will use that area strategically. I don't expect to have significant members providing communications to council, but what this does, it allows that option to be able to do that when it dictates that it needs to be done. So as I said, I have no concern with respect to the communication section.
Okay. Following that then, so we can't, because we're also often censured on emails if too many of us reply, or if somebody sends an email out and then somebody goes, hey, I agree with that, but did you think about this? Somebody will chime in and go, you're having that debate now. So I guess how does this not contravene that in a sense? The fact that we're having a debate sort of outside of a meeting in a sense.
Through Mr. Chair, I'm assuming we're not having meetings or debates outside of the regular council process. This area allows for a member of council to submit a communication, hopefully with respect to an item that's on the agenda, to allow council and the community an opportunity to see their position. We don't have meetings outside of meetings.
Right. Is there a caveat, or could we, obviously not at this meeting, but at council, could we restrict this to be to items on the agenda of the current meeting so that we have at least some framework and we're not just sort of like throwing communications that are totally unrelated? Like, is that something we could adjust the procedural bylaw to do? Is there the ability to adjust the wording that says for council to use this privilege, it must be in relation to what was on the agenda that evening? Will that be legal, I guess?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, it is limited within the scope of the current, or I should say the proposed procedural bylaw, but given the fact that this bylaw is under review right now with recommendations going to council, council or committee can entertain further amendments with respect to this section, either at a committee or at council.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Another line, this is going back to my earlier questioning. So there is a caveat in this that allows a member of the public and or staff going forward to attend a meeting electronically. I guess as far as council is concerned, we would still need to be physically there. Is there, or would we need to amend it, or is there an ability? And I'm just thinking of, there could be a certain circumstance where a counselor is away on perhaps council business or out of the country and we need to meet quorum. So are there instances that we have considered that would allow a counselor to attend virtually, seeing as members of the public and staff are able to do it for some meetings? For instance, if somebody, hurt their back and was just unable to physically get to City Hall, do we have mechanisms within this to allow for those extenuating circumstances? Another one I can think of is we're going to be dealing with COVID for quite some time. There may not be a magic bullet. This may never go away. So it could be, there's no state of emergency. We're a year from now and two counselors happen to think they were exposed. And so they go into some type of self-isolation so as not to spread it. And that happens to be when a council meetings. And so they could stay home and virtually attend, but that option's not built in for them. So is this something that we can consider or add in, that in an extenuating circumstance, a counselor that's available would be able to attend and for the purposes of meeting quorum as well? Is that something we can build in?
To Mr. Chair, to the councillor, that is something that we're looking at this point. We're not recommending like a hybrid type of meeting where members of the council are both either virtual or here physically. But that 6 months that we have in there is going to give us an opportunity to test how that might work. And then council will have the opportunity to make a decision on how we proceed going further with respect to exactly what you're talking about. So the short answer to that question is yes.
Okay, perfect. Appreciate that. Thank you.
At this point, I would just mention to remind the committee that, so using Councillor Boehm's example, if Councillor Boehm wished, when this goes to council, Councillor Boehm could propose an amendment asking staff to explore the option of having councillors also attend virtually under limited circumstances or something like that. That would be an example of an amendment to the bylaw that council could consider at council. If we make any of those types of recommendations here, they will not be binding. They will just go to council as recommendations. Right? So both options are possible. My personal thought on that is to avoid the situation where we do a lot of work here at committee on amendments, and we know how they can get complicated in a hurry, only to find out that when it gets to council, the amendment politically doesn't fly or whatever. So so keep that in mind. If we make any, if we propose any amendments to the bylaw itself here at committee, they're non-binding and they go as a recommendation to council. If you make an amendment at council and it passes, it's passed council. So that's really the place to make it. But this is a great place to discuss which aspects of the proposed bylaw we might want to look at changing when it does get to council. And how would we suggest to council that we approach that? So you see what I'm saying? Is like, we need to find a way to make this conversation productive, knowing that everything we do here is non-binding. So, so that's why you could ask the clerk about that here, Councillor Boehm, but it really, the test will be whether council goes for it. Yes, Mr. Clerk.
Through you, Mr. Chair, just to be clear, I'm just going to read out the recommendation that council approved. It says that report number 91, clause 4, received from the CEO, recommend be deferred to the Administrative Policies Committee for review and to make recommendations to council, particularly but not exclusively, regarding the provisions on electronic meetings and the provision for determining the location of council meetings, and that the Administrative Policies Committee report back to council no later than the second meeting in February 2021. So this meeting is the opportunity for members of committee to review the bylaws in detail and make recommendations that will then be forwarded up to council. So our committee does have that opportunity to make those recommendations this evening if they're so inclined. Alternatively, something can go up to council and then we can re-debate this again at council with whatever amendments that we're looking forward to. And to close the loop with Councillor Boehm, Councillor, we don't technically need a recommendation to a hybrid meeting. We're already looking into that. And that 6-month window gives us that chance to test it out, to see what works. And then we'll come back with a further report to council dealing with the logistics and the costs, benefits of doing it this way, so that council can make that an informed decision. Thank you.
So just further to that wording, council did defer this for input from us on the provisions around electronic meetings. So maybe when we're done with questions, when this is on the floor, maybe we should have a segment of tonight's meeting that should just deal with that one aspect, because that was specifically in the deferral. I'm just making that suggestion. Yes, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Chair, I apologize for interrupting. That particular section of that resolution was addressed at our previous meeting. We went into the bylaw and amended it to take into consideration an amendment that was brought forward by Councillor McLaren, I believe. So that section has been dealt with as part of the review.
Okay.
The amendment was approved.
Yes, there was an amendment on that subject that was approved. That doesn't mean it was the only amendment possible.
That's correct. But with respect to that particular section, as part of the deferral from council, that amendment has been approved. If we're going to revisit that, we're looking at a reconsideration of the amendment.
Yeah, no, you're Mr. Clerk, I understand you're trying to be helpful, but you're actually muddying the waters. That amendment has already been passed. Thank you for reminding us. But Councillor Bohm was talking about a different aspect of electronic meetings. He's talking about a councillor attending virtually, because this draft bylaw has provisions for members of the public and for staff to attend virtually, but not councillors. That's what Councillor Bohm was talking about. We could come to consensus here tonight at this committee, but that doesn't mean council will also reach the same consensus. That was my point. And so I don't know whether whether the members here want to explore any amendments in that sense. We'll find out when it's on the floor. Right now we're still in questions. So Councillor Bohm, you have the floor for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And through you, I guess furthering the electronic meetings question, and again, I understand what the clerk was saying there in regards to some of this work I think has occurred in the background, so I don't want to move a bunch of recommendations or even offer them if this work's already happening in the background, which I'm sure it is. I guess my other thought would be the world is becoming more virtual. We know it. With that, there's also opportunities to take advantage of things, and I believe sort of a climate lens as well. So picture, if you will, some of the meetings, for instance, maybe our last council meeting where, you know, we have staff, council, everybody go down to City Hall, meet in that one spot, whether they're, you know, driving, taking the bus, or however they're getting there. There may be a carbon footprint associated with that. I understand there's a carbon footprint associated with virtual and video meetings as well. But we're having everybody go down, and then maybe we have a 10-minute meeting, and then everybody disperses. So is it being considered as well as part of this, Mr. Clerk, that some meetings, for instance, some committee meetings and some council meetings, maybe if there's a smaller agenda, could possibly be done virtually to avoid having a massive people congregate at one spot and then disperse and possibly 15 minutes later? So would there be a mechanism built in to allow us to, I guess, or the mayor and the clerk and the CAO, based on the agenda, consider that this meeting, due to the perhaps lateness, if you will, of the agenda, could be held virtually, and on a go forward basis, it like basically on its own, nothing to do with the state of emergency, nothing to do with any COVID or anything, but just with this meeting and the agenda proposed, we feel that we should have a virtual meeting. The other caveat to that is, one of the things that I've heard is I've had engagement from people that typically will not attend City Hall and maybe won't watch it. But right now, with how we're doing the meetings and it's more of a virtual format, I've been getting engagement from a whole different section of the community that's all of a sudden following it, whether it's through Twitter or online or anything. So we're reaching almost a greater portion of our community. and even the younger community, because going virtual is the way things are going. So with that in mind, maybe even just having an understanding that one meeting a year will be done virtually outside of any emergency order or any of that other things, just to sort of maintain our ability to do that. It keeps us in practice should there be another pandemic, and it keeps us on top of how, you know, these technologies progress, so that we'd never kind of be caught, you know, not really understanding it in the event of another lockdown or something like that. So is all that kind of being considered within that envelope of what you mentioned, Mr. Clerk, of how staff would be reviewing and considering things on a go-forward basis?
Through Mr. Chair, the short answer to that question is yes. Once again, I comment on this 6-month period that we have in there to give us the opportunity to come up with different scenarios for council's review and decision. I agree with you that virtual meetings generally are better for the carbon footprint. It allows for greater accessibility and provides for better real-time decision-making as well, in the sense that members of the community and council don't have to attend City Hall, look for parking for them to be able to come up here. And given the current social distancing and different things that are going to go into the year and then some, we're definitely looking at that and to see whether council may decide perhaps to stay virtual forever.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, and one final caveat to that is I know that sometimes some restrictions on these positions could just be as simple as somebody's childcare falling through and they just can't drive down to City Hall because they may be leaving their children unattended and it's an unforeseen event. But that's something where that counselor could perhaps then have that opportunity to go, hey, you know what? I can't physically be there, but I can be there virtually because, you know, my kids are just sleeping upstairs and I need to be in the house. So just kind of some of those other considerations that are there, which actually in the future could perhaps open up this opportunity to for people to run who may have never considered it before because they have young children. So just some thoughts that I've had and some feedback from constituents. Thank you.
Through Mr. Chair, I would agree with Councillor Bohm. That definitely is something that we're looking at. All options are on the table at this point.
Okay. We'll have to improve our audio, of course, if we're going to do lots of these virtual meetings. Okay, so so Councillor Osterhoff, you're going to go next because you haven't spoken yet. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and you can correct me if I'm. This has already been solved, so I apologize. I'm trying to understand. I get all this. It was mentioned about the Mr. Rogers article in the WIG and a letter pertaining to how we as councillors have what freedoms we have to speak. I failed to see that in this bylaw where we might be and are restricted. And can you point me to that, or is that a concern with this particular topic tonight?
Mr. Chair, we're not concerned with respect to communication. There are a number of items and areas within the procedure by the talk about quorum and whatnot. And they're consistent with what other municipalities are doing in province. As I said before, we did not add anything that made it more restrictive for committee and council to deal with. As we said, we encourage a healthy debate with respect to the items coming forward.
Okay, thank you just for that. I just need to hear that again. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're on the second round of questions, and it's for Councillor Schwab.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Also up for discussion tonight is the committee bylaws. Is that correct?
Through Mr. Chair, that is correct. There is an amendment that has been recommended by staff dealing with the amendment to the committee bylaw, dealing with deferrals.
So we have a great deal of difference. So committee bylaws, quite frankly, I think has been something that we haven't really spent a lot of time focusing on. So it's not something I would be prepared to put forward to council. And the reason being is we had several experiences over the appointments committee in the last period where our bylaws were used to basically throw it in our face. They followed our bylaws. And I'm thinking in particular, we need some greater clarity on the Taxi Commission, Kingston Economic Development Corporation, and even Kingston Electricity Distribution Limited. You know, all that it states there is that the mayor of the city will be the member. There's no amendment to perhaps suggest we could have or designate of the mayor. With regards to Conservation Authority, there's amendments that could be made since we spend so much money there. The Kingston Nonprofit Housing Corporation, it needs to be a 2-year term. I think it needs to be addressed. There's other aspects of this particular policy document that I think need to have further clarification, because we have run into issues with appointments causing conflict, causing great strife. And I think we need to have some clarity within the document so that we don't end up having similar problems for future committee members of the Appointments Committee.
Hang on, before you answer, Mr. Clerk, Councillor Chappelle, are you referring to the Nominations Committee appointing people to serve on these boards? Or because the committee bylaw regulates the rules of the rules around committee meetings and conduct and rules for committees.
It also, you, Mr. Chair, it also dictates what the makeup of the boards are. So I'm not concerned about the Appointments Committee itself, because it's a very generalized mandate. But like, for example, the Kingston Economic Development Corporation consists of the mayor and 3 members of council, each appointed for 1 year. But it doesn't give any direction as to how the remainder of the committee is appointed. And so if we had clarity here that the Kingston Economic Development Corporation will submit a list of qualified names for consideration in excess of the number of vacancies available for the committee to choose, would prevent all sorts of public scrutiny and problems that we feel that that basically rubber stamping effect. So we don't have the mechanisms within our own bylaws that allow us to structure the appointments in such an efficient and effective manner.
So is your question to the clerk, where is that in this bylaw work? Where can we find that?
Yes.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor. To be clear, there is one amendment proposed to the committee bylaw, and that is dealing with the items that are deferred by committee and the idea that they need to be reported to council for council to make a decision. With respect to your second point, with various committees, you'll recall that there were a couple of recommendations that were passed within the last couple of months, wherein our department is taking a look at all the committees. And so we'll be able to attach or deal with some of those things you referred to as part of our review. So staff is taking a look at the various committees, the appointment processes and whatnot.
Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Clerk. And I would suggest then, if there's a more comprehensive approach to looking at the roles of various committees, that the recommendation brought forward tonight for consideration by this committee is really mute and really should be deferred until the balance of that entire proposal is brought forward.
To you, Mr. Chair, we're talking apples and oranges here. The amendment to the committee bylaw deals with deferred matters. Work that we're undertaking based on the 2 council motions deals specifically with taking a look at the appointment process and a number of other areas dealing with the committee. So they are 2 different things, and one doesn't need to wait for the other to happen. Should committee and council want to make a decision with respect to that proposed amendment before them tonight.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to rule that the questions surrounding compositions of boards and anything coming out of those 2 council motions that the clerk just referenced is not in order tonight, because what's in order tonight is the draft bylaw. Thank you, Councillor Chappelle, for an interesting topic. Okay, so I'll ask another question because it's relevant. It was already mentioned and I didn't want to lose sight of it. The clerk made several mentions of the 6-month extension for the virtual meetings past the declaration of state of emergency being declared over. So what I'm hearing in his explanations is that it's not just a 6-month extension, but it's also a kind of a pilot period for things like hybrid meetings, things like having virtual attendance and like hybrid where it's virtual and in-person mixed together, having under what circumstances do we want to try virtual meetings, like Councillor Bohm suggested, for shorter meetings to save fuel and so on. So is that all part of this? Is it in the language of the draft bylaw that all these things that have been mentioned are being examined, or is that just, you're just telling us that because you know that that work will be happening in that period?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the proposed bylaws that you have before you, they are in order to get the business of the committee in play. And that's why we put the 6-month number in there to give us an opportunity to take a look at other options that we may want to consider, both from staff perspective and ultimately the council decision. So we're looking at pretty much everything: hybrid meetings, virtual meetings, physical meetings, and we're trying to come up with what we think are the best options to present to council. We'll come back to council with a consider report outlining the various options, and council then will make the decision, hopefully based on our professional opinion, or at the end of the day, what the community and council want to do. So this is just to ensure that we have a practice in place for the next 6 months, given the fact that we're under the emergency, both municipal as well as at the higher levels of government.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions at this point? We have strayed into some of our interpretations, which is fine, but really we're looking for questions of clarity on the draft bylaw so that we can make a productive suggestion to council. Seeing none, go back to the package here. So that was questions from members of the committee. So now we would go, I believe, Madam Clerk, we would go to questions from visiting councillors. Is that correct?
It is correct, Mr. Chair. At this time, we do not have any members of the public present in the meeting to speak to the matter.
Okay, so we have I see Councillor Hill has turned on his video. So we have a visiting councillor. He does not get to vote here at committee, but seeing as most of what we're doing here is making suggestions to council, I think his presence is every bit as valid as ours. So go ahead, Councillor Hill.
Oh, I'm just here to listen. Thanks, Councillor Stroud.
Okay. So I'm looking for hands. The clerk has said there's no members of the public present, and that is what I'm seeing under attendees. There's 0. There's a few members of staff already introduced by the clerk. There's Councillor Hill and the 6 of us. And that's it. Okay. So I guess we would then need a mover and a seconder for the committee recommendation. Did you have a question, Councillor Kiley? Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Through you, I'm not trying to belabor the point, and I know it's been asked twice already, but I'm just trying to get clarity myself to go back to Councillor McLaren's original question about, are there any legal kind of prescriptions about why we couldn't count a returning councillor to a meeting for the presiding side? We're looking for any statutory rules that would prevent that from being possible.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, you're asking for a legal type of opinion. Jenna Morley is with our legal department and would be more than pleased to comment on that legally.
Thank you.
Morley, go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair, more than pleased. There is no legal impediment to this type of clause. We would, of course, want to see it drafted narrowly to be very clear that it's specific to a motion to reconsider and doesn't have any unintended consequences in other areas of the bylaw, but it would be legally permitted.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions before we move the recommendation? Okay, so the business 7A, a bylaw to provide rules for governing the order and procedures of the Council of the Corporation of the City of Kingston and to repeal bylaw number 2010-1, Council procedural bylaw is amended in its entirety, and corresponding amendment to committee bylaw number 2010-205. So we've had questions about the report. The recommendation is there. I could read it, but basically the recommendation is that the new amended bylaw be presented to council for 3 readings, and that includes the repealing of the old bylaw, and that the new committee bylaw, amended committee bylaw, be presented to council for 3 readings. That's the content of the 2 clauses. So, and then if you look at the package, it continues on with a couple of notes. I'm sure you've read them. basically it tells the chronology of how this arrived in November to council, was deferred here with a stipulation that we report back by February 2021, and which is where we are now. And then the amendment that the clerk mentioned is in the second note, and that is the reworked section of the electronic meetings during an emergency. And all the clauses there are 6:19 to 6:25. You'll notice that a lot of the things we were just discussing about electronic meetings is in that wording in the bottom there. That is, Mr. Clerk, the wording that was as a result of an amendment that asked staff to change the wording as a result of Councilor McLaren's amendment, correct?
Mr. Chair, you are correct.
Yeah. So we need a mover and a seconder for the two clauses. Oh, point of order, Councilor Kiley.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I don't think you have the advantage of seeing your screen while you're helpfully recapping the agenda, but Councilor Chappelle is trying to get in for another question, I believe.
Okay, Councilor Chappelle, do you have a question?
Yes, through your chair. Before I ask my question, I just wanted to make a comment that I really appreciate the extraordinary effort that staff has made through the clerk's office to present the blue line, black line version and that chart to follow. It helped me assess the issues of concern. And what I'd like to do is, if we're going to put forward this motion, I'd like to split the motion because I'm adamantly or vehemently opposed to the change in the procedural bylaw that doesn't allow us to continue to discuss and forces us to send it up to council for a decision.
Okay. So, so I guess that's a question to the clerks. Procedurally, how would we separate out, how would you suggest we separate out the items that we might wish to argue against at council?
Sure, Mr. Chair. I believe what we're looking at is following the council direction to report back to council next week with a recommendation or recommendations from this committee. If there are certain things that the committee has concerns with and they want to make the amendments tonight, they can. If the idea is to send it up to council and then make the amendments at council, they can. So I think what you're doing is you're taking a look at the recommendation holistically in the context of how it's written in the agenda with the amendment. If that recommendation is approved, it'll go into an agenda for the next council meeting. And once again, committee and all of council does have the opportunity to make any changes that they wish at that time.
Okay. So the answer is by amendment, either for our committee, and if it were here, it would be non-binding. So, so yes, we need a mover and a seconder for the recommendation. Just to get it on the floor. This isn't to call the vote. Moved by Councillor Kiley, seconded by Councillor Oosterhoff. So now we're in deliberations. What I really would like as the chair of the committee, knowing that we're going to be presenting a recommendation to council, we have identified a few areas of concern. However, in its current form, other than the previously described amendment, there has been only one amendment from the interactions so far, and it's the one that that's in the package right there. So what are we going to do about these other contentious aspects of the draft bylaw? And then that's where I want to focus. That's the question I'm asking, and you can approach it however you like, but I'm looking for suggestions. Councillor Sharon.
Well, I have a few amendments, or at least one or two amendments, but I'd also like to maybe make a list on things that we may want to bring up later in council. But at your discretion or convenience, I'd like to make an amendment to move up to council a slight two changes, one I've talked about and one I haven't yet.
Okay, so maybe we should try one of your amendments and see what that looks like. And then knowing that but whether it is passed or whether it doesn't pass, it goes to council either way once you make it, right? So that is a way of, or maybe that's incorrect. Mr. Clerk, am I wrong about that?
Mr. Chair, yes. Lost amendments are not forwarded up to council per se. Lost motions are, like the complete recommendation. So this evening, if we're deciding to go in to amend the bylaws, we would have to have the wording for what the amendment should be. If there's some direction to staff, we can bring that up at the same time at the council next week.
Okay. So did you hear that? So Councilor McLaren, if you make an amendment and it fails here, it doesn't go to council. If it passes, it goes to council for council's consideration. Okay. Did you want to keep going, Councilor?
Sorry, did I just hear that right? I have to make an amendment now, and if it fails, I can bring it up again on council.
I don't think that's what the clerk said.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct. As I indicated previously, ideally, the amendments will probably happen at council. I'm starting to figure with this particular group, but if there are some amendments that this committee wants to bring forward to amend the recommendation in the two bylaws, please bring them forward now, and a vote should be taken. And if the amendment carries, then that is what will go up to council. If you want to save the amendment till council and debate in front of all of council, that's fine as well.
Okay, I circulated a suggested amendment. I suggested also to the legal department there, and hope that you've had a chance to review it, but I'll read it again. And hopefully there's, is this a, do I need a seconder for a recommendation as opposed to a motion, Mr. Clerk?
Absolutely. Mr. Chair, yes, any amendment requires a mover and a seconder. Correct.
Okay. So with the hope that there will be a seconder, I would like to move the following amendment. For determining, quote, the prevailing side, unquote, during a proposed vote of reconsideration, a newly arrived formerly absent member who missed the vote shall be considered as having been on the prevailing side.
Do we have that, Madam Clerk, do we have that so up on the screen? Can we put that up on the screen?
Oops, sorry, I think I sent the earlier version, reconsideration as opposed to reconsider, a vote of reconsideration.
Okay, so that you see it on the screen. For determining the prevailing side during a proposed vote of reconsideration, a newly arrived, formerly absent member who missed the vote shall be considered as being on the prevailing side. I'm just on the, can we keep the wording up for a minute? Not clear, the meaning's not clear to me of the middle.
The rationale that I was hoping, I heard earlier that it's the prevailing side that is the determining factor in the text right now, or in the laws right now, as to who can vote. So this is meant to amend just that part without touching anything else. The determination of which is the prevailing side. There's the people who voted on the winning side, whether it be a yes or a no. This is meant to say that a newly arrived, formerly absent councillor who missed that vote would be considered on the prevailing side, so that he can in fact call a reconsideration. Otherwise, he cannot, or she cannot.
Okay, Councillor, would it not be plainer language to just say, forget about the prevailing side stuff and just say a councillor who was absent at the beginning of a meeting may move reconsideration later in the same meeting?
Okay with that, if the legal department feels it's okay.
Yes, Ms. Morley.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. I don't know that there's an intentional distinction being made between a counselor who simply arrived late and a counselor who was absent entirely. Is that an intentional distinction you're making, Councillor McLaren?
Because after a reconsideration at a later date, no, I guess not. Sorry, no, my apologies. I was thinking too much on that, or not enough, apparently.
So the context of this is important. If for a member of council to move reconsideration in the same meeting that a decision is made, after the decision is made, a simple majority is needed, but the councillor must have been on the side that prevailed in the vote. Correct, Mr. Clerk?
You're correct. And as indicated previously, it is parliamentary procedure for that when an item comes forward for reconsideration, that the member of council needs to be in attendance to be able to move the reconsideration. After all, to move a reconsideration is one of those draconian efforts. And if you weren't even at the meeting, that leaves it with a little impetus for you to understand what the debate was all about and move the reconsideration. That's why within our bylaw, the current one as well as the past one, and as with other municipalities, that is part of a staple with respect to how reconsideration occurs. I mean, the question was asked whether there's a legal impediment, and that answer was provided by Ms. Morley. But when you talk about procedurally, you need to be in attendance to be able to deal with the reconsideration, and you should be on the prevailing side. I'll leave it for Ms. Morley to add some more to that if she'd like.
Yeah, yeah. I was just asking a question for context of the amendment, but Ms. Morley, do you have something else to say?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to clarify, and not to suggest this would ever happen, but this type of provision does open the door to sort of mischievous use of the motion to reconsider, in that it would allow a councillor to intentionally abstain or be absent from a meeting in order to raise a motion to reconsider at a later point. So it is something to consider. And in our research, it is a best practice of almost every municipality's council procedure bylaw that we looked at, that you have to be voting and in attendance and on the prevailing side in order to bring a motion to reconsider.
So that clarifies the original thinking. So when you mentioned that originally, it wasn't occurring to me that it might be at a later date as well. So the original wording is meant to overcome that in later, that nefarious use of it. However, there is a less than democratic, less than ideal way of that the laws are right now. So in addition to what might be the norm in other less advanced municipalities and forms of government, I'm suggesting that we can go beyond best practices and exceed them, because what we have identified in a past situation is where the laws and our bylaws were used to limit the actual will of council. Now, with regards to the notion that we have to be at the meeting in order to understand the full debate and all that, that's why we have a book ahead of time, or we have our package ahead of time to study those issues, come up with an opinion, and hopefully raise them. Now, if in a situation where you are on council business and you are late, you can start that debate again, because that would be a more wholesome, more fulsome, and more accurate description of the will of council, where there isn't any trickery used of procedural bylaws. So in order to avoid that in the future, because it happened once, I submit to you that it may be better to allow it in that meeting at that time, and as originally stated, so don't take out that the part that would make it for other meetings, in a way, and thereby improve the situation as opposed to making it worse or keeping it bad. Because democracy also advances, right? We can make things better with experience, and that's the point of this exercise in total, isn't it?
Okay, so there's an amendment on the floor, and Councillor McLaren, the wording that was on the screen is the wording that you're submitting?
I believe so. So if it's understood that it's meant in that meeting alone, not in a subsequent meeting.
Okay, so we do need you to change the wording, and we need a seconder. So I'm going to call a 3-minute recess. Councillor McLaren, get the wording that you want to submit exact, and then we'll come back and we'll get your seconder, and we'll move forward from there. 3-minute recess. Thank you.
Ms. Morley, Mr. Bolognoni, I just sent you proposed wording based on what you have heard. Does that match what you're looking for?
We will start in a second. I realized I forgot to shut my door and the kids are making noise. One sec. Does anyone know any silent kids? I don't. Ryan doesn't. Anyways, so it's been 3 minutes. Councillor McLaren, do you have your wording?
Yes, I believe I do.
Would the clerks have it to put up on the screen?
Actually, no, I don't think they do. I'm just sending it to them.
Okay, so we'll wait till...
Read it, or do you want me to just send it, or should I read it?
Send it and then read it. But it is helpful to have it up on the screen. Madam Clerk, do you have it?
Not yet, Mr. Chair. I have not received it.
Is there a way of getting like a split screen somehow where the amendment can stay up and we can still see each other? Is there
You want a Chromebook or what do you want?
I'm on the little Dell machine that we got, you know. I do have a second screen, but I don't know. Because if it's on Zoom, I can't split it off, right?
I think I just sent it.
There's a way in your settings, but I pretty much have to be there to show you.
Is it with the views? Like, can I change the views?
Your projector views, usually you can have a second screen.
Projector view.
Sorry, Madam Clerk, I think I got your email wrong. Let's try that again.
Right click under display settings and go to multiple views there. So and see.
Display settings, display settings.
Right click on your main screen.
Like
display settings, and then you go down to multiple displays, and then you go detect.
Madam Clerk, I'm missing your email. It doesn't seem to be coming up when I type in E. What is your last name? It doesn't appear there.
It's Fawcett, Fawcett.
Still not coming up. ESAWTT at cityofkingston.ca.
F as in Frank, A, W as in wagon, CETT.
Thank you. Thank you. It should be there any second now.
Councillor Stroud, when you're on your settings, when you click on your video settings and you go to video settings, there's if you click on general, there's a use dual monitors checkbox that should be checked.
Well, I've got Google Chrome on one monitor and the Zoom meeting on the other monitor, but when the clerk posts the amendment, it's on Zoom. So there's no way of seeing people's faces on Zoom and seeing the screen which comes through Zoom. There's no way of splitting those two things off, right?
Yes, there is. It's through that. So
Is
if you
there-
click on
Yeah,
the bottom, you see where the stop video button is, and there's a little arrow. Click
Yeah.
on the little arrow.
Yeah.
Click video
Vid-
settings.
video settings,
Click general.
general.
Use dual monitors. See on the right, third item down.
Yeah, use dual monitors. Okay. And what happens over here? Okay, so when she puts that up, it'll split into two monitors.
So it should display on the other other window, and you can move that to your other monitor if it's connected.
Yes, I have that. Okay. Great. Thank you, Commissioner Joyce. All right. Moved by Councillor McLaren. So we need a seconder for this amendment. Seconded by Councillor Kiley. For determining the prevailing side during a proposed vote of reconsideration, a newly arrived, formerly absent member who missed the vote in that meeting shall be considered as being on the prevailing side. Isn't that the exact same wording you just had?
No, I added the term "in that meeting" so as to not allow it to continue beyond that meeting. And I added a comma somewhere, I forget where.
When you say formally, you say formally absent, that means you were absent at the roll call at the beginning of the meeting?
Yes. I just prefer I said late. It seemed better.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so it's moved by Councillor Kiley. So now we go to deliberations on the amendment. Councillor McLaren has already spoken, but you will have the ability to speak last. Before we proceed, the clerk would like to say something. Go ahead, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Chair, in light of what Councillor McLaren is recommending, I think there's a simple way to accommodate what he's saying, something that would be at Exhibit A be amended in Section 13.29I by adding "or who is absent from the vote" at the end of the section, so that it now reads, may be made by a member of council who voted on the prevailing side of the decision proposed for reconsideration or who was absent from the vote. That may be procedurally the right way to bring the amendment forward, if that's what he's looking to do.
I will trust the clerk's way of looking at it in the best way possible. I think he captures what I'm trying to do, and I'm satisfied with that particular version of it. It seems to
It is a friendly amendment. So you're saying the clerks would have to write this down, but you're saying add to the existing wording "or was absent from the vote" words. Right?
Correct.
That's an amendment to the actual bylaw. That is more direct. So, Councillor McLaren, is that what you want to wish or want to move? Okay, so we may have to take a recess for the clerks to get that in writing. This time the clerks will have to put it up. Do you have a question, Councillor Kiley?
I'm just wondering about the new wording. I'm not sure if this is in order because I'm not really sure how this is shaking out right now if the clerk is recommending a friendly amendment. But I think, Councillor McLaren, you articulated the person needs to be present at the meeting at which the vote was held. And I'm not sure if that would be captured in the new wording, because I understand why the clerk is doing that. So we don't have someone presumed on the prevailing side brings it forward and then maybe votes against it. But shouldn't it be that the person has to be at the meeting, Councillor McLaren, as opposed to just someone who missed the vote in general?
That was the intent of my motion, and the point is that somebody arrives late. Like exactly like you guys were all there at that council meeting, right? I arrived late. I was on council business. I should have been able to consider that.
Okay. Yes, we know what happened. Mr. Clerk, Does your wording with just that addition of that simple phrase, or who was absent for the vote, does that cover the situation described by Councilor McLaren of a member that was absent for the vote but present for the meeting?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it does, but I wouldn't mind a quick recess just to ensure that we can put the proper motion up there. And, you know, to be clear, all I'm offering is the procedural way of getting Councilor McLaren's motion up there. We're still of the opinion that should get.
Yeah. You know what? Before we call a recess for the thing, this is a committee. It can be a little bit less formal. Why don't we see whether the committee agrees? Does anyone on the committee not understand what Councilor McLaren is proposing? You guys don't understand? Or you want to speak? Okay. So why don't we debate? I think if it's clear what Councilor McLaren wants, and we assume that the clerk can deliver it, before he goes and writes it, maybe we should get to the point where we see whether we support it. So we should debate it first. That's what we'll do, Mr. Clerk. We'll debate it first. And if after the debate it passes, we will ask for the wording and we'll make it official. Does that make sense? Mr. Clerk?
Mr. Chair, before we do vote on that motion, we definitely want to be able to put it up on the screen for not just the committee, but other people that are viewing this meeting so that they know what the vote is being taken on.
Okay. Are you able to work on the wording, Mr. Clerk, while I go to members of the committee for their comments? And while maybe when they're done their comments, you'll have the wording?
I can do that, but I won't be able to answer any questions should they be posed at this time. So to be perfectly honest, if you give us a few minutes to craft that motion, we can put that up on the screen and everybody will know that which is being debated. So I leave it out in your hands, Chair Stroud.
All right, well, I'm going to put it to a vote of committee. So it's by the clerk that we have a 5-minute recess. All those in favor? All those opposed? All right, that passes 4-2. 5-minute recess. See you in 5 minutes. Okay, we've got quorum, but we don't have all of our members back, and I don't see the clerk. We're getting close. Okay, we've got all our members. So, I'm gonna go ahead with discussion. Councillor Bowman, then Councillor Chappelle, and then by the time we get around, we will have the wording. Hello, Mr. Clerk. Go ahead, Councillor Bowman.
Hey, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'm not going to support this, and the reason is I think it's just opening up the Pandora's box. Unfortunately, I understand the intention of the recommendation. I have a lot of concerns, though, that this can be used, and there'd be no way to craft it in such a way that it couldn't be used facetiously. So, for instance, you could have somebody intentionally show up late to a meeting and then go, well, I was absent and I didn't sit through the last 2 or 3 hours of that, but I'm now here and I'm going to move reconsideration on every single motion that passed tonight. And then it could just be done just facetiously, just to try to exhaust the other people, and for no better reason than you just disagree and you know that you're going to be on the losing side of a motion. So that's one reason, is I don't think there's a proper way to craft this. Also, I don't believe it actually advances anything, because I think one of the main caveats is actually being present at the meeting. So if you're not there and something happens, so for instance, let's say I miss a meeting and something passes that I disagree with, but I missed a meeting for the birth of my child, or I missed a meeting for some other emergency, I still wasn't there. So really, to come back after and sort of in a sense undermine or take away from all my colleagues that were there simply because my view was not what was passed, or what I wanted to support was not passed, would really be a disservice, I think. And I would have to accept that, yeah, I wasn't at that meeting, or yes, I missed that particular vote. But I'm now going back to each one of my compatriots and asking them to sit through it all again because I wasn't able to be there for whatever reason. There are a lot of legitimate reasons that you may not be there. But I just worry that with this is we're just opening up a Pandora's box. I also stress that we sometimes challenge best practices because we think there might be a better way. I would also argue, though, that if this is the best practice across most of Ontario and or even Canada, perhaps, there's probably a reason for that. And there's probably been meetings where somebody's come in and they didn't like a decision, and then they went and basically used this method to punish people for the next 2 or 3 hours to rehash already had debates on a losing side. And for instance, in the example given, we know that it would be, although the wording's been changed and we'll see what comes back, but if we were to use some of the previous wording, it would be, I want to be assumed to be on the winning side simply so that I can reconsider it to then make sure it loses. So it's like you're going to go through that whole thing. So the whole caveat there is basically, had I been here, it would have lost. Well, that's the important thing, is you needed to be there. And I understand why you weren't. I'm not arguing that. I understand you were on council business. But what happens when it's, something else, like, well, I really wanted to be there, but my car broke down, or I really wanted to be there, but I had an emergency and my house was flooding. There will be other legitimate reasons. So rewording this way, we're just opening up a Pandora's box of, well, the dog ate my homework, or I couldn't be there because of this. So can we please rehash that 2-hour debate now again, because I'm now here? And I just can't agree with that. I think it's just opening up a path that it's just going to lead to it could be used inappropriate so many times to drag on debate just endlessly. Thanks.
Thank you. Next up is Councillor Chappelle, and then Councillor Kylie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is actually for the mover. I don't recall what the situation was, and I was wondering, for my benefit, if you could explain to me what that motion was that you missed because of the Police Services Committee meeting, and what was the prevailing side, and what was the whole argument? Because I can't, I'm trying, I looked through my notes, I can't remember what the issue was.
Councillor McLaren.
There was an issue that we discussed in camera and then had to vote on in public. It was at the beginning of the meeting that we were reporting out on the in-camera stuff. I was trying to be there for the in-camera stuff. I was stuck in traffic coming in from Toronto, and it was a very close vote. In fact, it would have been the other way had I been there. The result was that we went to court. And I recall asking you, because you had said, I walked in like a few minutes literally a few minutes. I didn't even have a time to change. I was out of proper, I wasn't even wearing a tie. And I recall you asked me, you sent me a text in the middle of that thing. It's like, where were you? And I asked, did we miss it? And you said, yes, through text. I asked you if you would consider calling a reconsideration. You said no. That was the issue at the time. So does that help, or does that jog your memory?
I still don't remember what the issue was.
Well, anyways, for the purposes of this debate, we're talking about, yeah.
So my question then is really, I after hearing what Councillor Bohm had commented on, I do think this is more subject to gaming than it's worth as a proposal amendment. And I do think you have to be in person if at all possible if it's an important issue for you and your constituents. And so I can't support this amendment.
Thank you. Councillor Kiley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I'll start with a question to the clerk. Clerk, in your reading of this amendment, should it pass, would council still have the right to vote on whether a motion could be reconsidered or not?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the motion is quite specific. If you're not there at the meeting, irrespective of whether you're on city business or not, it will give you the opportunity to move the reconsideration. And as I indicated before, we did a best practice review of this particular subject based on the councillor's request. And what it revealed was that only a member who voted on the prevailing side could move the motion of reconsideration. And that's why we didn't bring a motion forward to change this. We will procedurally put a motion up there that will allow for what Councillor McLaren is looking for procedurally, but not in the sense that we're supporting this, because our best practice review does not support such a change.
All right, sorry, I probably wasn't clear on my question. What I'm wondering is, when someone moves to reconsider, does council have to vote on whether or not the motion can be reconsidered? Or is it just the single person who can move a reconsideration, therefore opening debate?
It needs to be moved and seconded. Every motion at council needs to be moved and seconded.
And voted on.
Absolutely.
In other words, council is the arbiter of whether or not a motion is to be reconsidered.
That is correct. Under our current procedural bylaw, you need to be on the prevailing side, and also the mayor can ask which way the mover voted with respect to that particular motion.
Right, so I'm totally comfortable with this motion. I actually think it's gracious and provides a courtesy for councillors who may be in extenuating circumstances. And for me, the fact that it's still up to council whether or not a motion is reconsidered at all completely dispels any Councillor Chappelle or Bohm's comments, because if council believes it's not appropriate to reconsider, they're going to vote no, and then the potential for gaming stops at that. So all of the hypotheticals which were used to put pejorative light on this amendment are just simply fallacious because council chooses whether or not a motion could be moved. No, it's true. Council would make the decision. Mr. Clerk, I'll just clarify with you because I see councillors shaking their head. Would a person who moves reconsideration be able to override council and make council reconsider a motion without the vote of council?
Through you, Mr. Chair, currently you need to be on the prevailing side. Under the proposed amendment being brought forth by Councillor McLaren, if you are absent, you could still, as one of the movers and seconders, the mover, move that, and then based on whether it's at the same meeting, which is a simple majority, or at a subsequent meeting, which is a 2/3 vote, that could happen. So no one individual member of council can override council itself.
Perfect. Thank you for saying that. No one individual member of council can override council itself. Therefore, I trust my colleagues on council to make the decision whether or not the extenuating circumstances would warrant such a reconsideration. And I would underscore my belief that this is a courtesy. This is to extend a councillor who is doing business, and this is the example being used tonight, so I'll go with it, of council, directed by council, to be allowed to vote on a council motion. And if we're worried about gaming, let's be honest with the fact that scheduling when votes happen could also be a game. So if someone is not there and a motion is brought forward at a particular time, if we're casting doubt on whether or not things are being gamed, that is potentially on the other side of how things could work. So let's trust council. Let's not frame this as an individual having more power than they have. And let's also recognize the fact that there will still be a vote, even if this were to move through. It doesn't mean that the person suggesting it would ultimately win, even if they get it considered. So I think this is a courtesy for members of council, and I'll be more than happy to support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bohm, I see your hand, but you're only permitted to speak once to the amendment. Mr. Clerk, can you confirm the mover has the ability to speak twice, correct?
That's correct.
Yes. So unfortunately, it can't go back to you, Councillor Bohm. Councillor Straw, if you haven't spoken yet, if you don't, do you have something to say? Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say. I really do appreciate the discussion, though. I can't support the motion. I feel uncomfortable with it, and I probably can't articulate it myself as well as you guys, but it feels disruptive to me. And I understand that council is the one that makes the decision, but it just doesn't feel right to me in this situation. So I can't support it.
Thank you. I guess I'll take my turn, Mr. Vice Chair, if you don't mind just taking the chair for a minute.
I'll take the chair and recognize you, Councillor Shred.
Thank you. So I moved reconsideration in a very high profile item in my first term of council, my first year on council, actually. It was for the Memorial Center School. The original vote, I was on the prevailing side. I voted against considering the Memorial Center School. And then my constituents came out and I got almost 1,000 emails from constituents asking me to change my mind. And I did. And that's why I moved reconsideration. It was as pure a reconsideration as you could ever ask for, where I had actually firmly believed one thing and then was convinced to go the other way by my constituents. That was a true motion of reconsideration. When it came back to council, actually, two of my colleagues also changed their votes, but because you needed 2/3 majority and the original vote was 9-4 in favor, it was not successful. But I was permitted to move it because of the fact that I had voted the other way, right? So there in that anecdote, you see what reconsideration usually is, or the reason that reconsideration exists, to allow council to change its mind. It isn't changing the rules so that you can, an absent member could then move reconsideration is really a peripheral issue. It did happen to Councillor McLaren, and the correct thing, the correct way to get out of it, which didn't happen unfortunately, would have been for one of your colleagues that did vote on the reconsideration as an honorable act in consideration of the absent member and in keeping with the rules of order. Unfortunately, that didn't happen at the time, and the ruling was made that Councillor McLaren could move reconsideration, and he's trying to right that wrong here today, and I fully understand why. However, what we're doing is we're writing the rules for the next term and all future councils. And so in what circumstance can this ever be repeated? Only can be repeated if there's a tie vote and an absent councillor that would have broken the tie. That's the only time that vote is in play. And it's not really reconsideration. What it is our first vote was taken without all of us being here. Let's take another vote with all of us here. That's not really reconsideration. That's it's a revote. It may be a fully justified, morally justified revote, but it's not consistent with the rules of order. And so it's up to each of us individually to decide whether that is correct or not, and whether we should alter the procedural bylaw or not. So I don't see the harm in it, but I really want to make the point that this is expanding the definition of every consideration to something else. It makes me uncomfortable, but not enough to oppose the motion. So I will actually support it. Thank you.
I'll turn the chair back to you.
Thank you. So Councillor McLaren, you get the last word.
Thank you. All right, so a quick question to Mr. Bolognoni. How many times in your experience has a councillor called reconsideration on everything that they may have voted for in a particular meeting?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I have not experienced that.
Thank you. I ask my fellow councillors, how many jerks do you think would get elected doing that? Just a rhetorical question. I don't think this is disruptive. I think that Councillor Kiley is correct. It's a way of being courteous under exceptional circumstances. And to echo Councillor Stroud's point, it is up to us, as in all of us councillors, to see and decide if something is worth looking into again. More than likely, if the majority of councillors don't think it's worth looking into, it won't be looked into. It's not that disruptive to have a quick vote to see if we can reconsider. And if it is worth looking into, then we really should be discussing that, and that's something that council should decide. But if we say no to this, we are blocking future councils from having that opportunity for a more wholesome, fulsome debate. Essentially, we're blocking somebody out. And that is, experience is what moves democracy forward. And this is then an opportunity to do that. Thank you.
So thank you. So everyone has spoken. I'll call the vote on the amendment. Can we just have it back up on the screen, Madam Clerk? Exhibit A be amended in section 13.29I by adding or who was absent from the vote at the end of the section so that it reads as follow. May be made by a member of council who voted on the prevailing side of the decision proposed for reconsideration or who was absent from the vote. That's the amendment. 1 second, I need to get the screen back. Oh, there it is. Point of order, Councillor Kennedy.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Through you, I'm trying to clarify what I did earlier. It's only someone who is absent during that meeting. Is that not correct? Because I don't think that language captures it, and maybe I missed it. Because to me, that would really change the calculation if it is whimsical at any time in the future. But I thought it was for the meeting in question.
Can we have the wording back up, please?
So if I may then suggest a friendly during the meeting in question after from the vote at the end, just to capture what Councillor McLaren had previously mentioned.
I would agree with that. That in fact captures better, I think, what would be my intention. It was not my intention to make this disruptive going forward. It was at the meeting.
Okay, so we're adding the wording or who was absent from the vote
during the meeting in question. Or a slight modification of that as per the clerk's advice, but the idea is to be gracious to someone who has a flat tire on the way to City Hall.
So can we have the amended wording up, please? Who was absent from the vote during the meeting in question? But I don't understand how that makes it clear. I don't understand what clarity that adds.
Yeah, you're right, Councillor. That was my poor wordsmithing on the spot. But again, the idea is the person has to be proposing that reconsideration during the same meeting. It's if they come late because someone jumped, they had to swerve and missed someone on the way down and got an fender bender or something, God forbid.
So absent from the vote, but present at the meeting.
You got it.
So they could also be in the bathroom.
Possibly, but I guess.
Okay.
This is
so,
not mine.
Mr. Clerk, what do you think about these proposed wordings?
Mr. Chair, I think we're trying to split hairs on that. We're talking about whether you're in the bathroom, whether you're at a meeting, whether an accident happens, whether you're sick. I mean, the wording is the wording. You're absent from that meeting for the vote. That's basically it. It doesn't matter whether it's that night and the next night, you were absent for that particular vote. And that's why we tried to keep it short and sweet and simple. If there's additional wording that the councillor would like in there, we'd be pleased to put it in. But I don't see it changing anything.
Well, hang on, Councillor Kylie. I got to go to the mover. Councillor McLaren.
Yes.
What do you want to do with your wording and with the friendly amendment that was proposed?
See it on the screen again, please.
I don't see what logical difference the last 5 words make.
We're trying to get to the point, and I see how it does. They're not complete either.
Who was absent from the vote. So you're trying to avoid someone moving reconsideration at a later council meeting. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, the original motion that I had out there, I thought made it clear, but I thought I heard that it was not clear in some sense.
Okay, but did you know that in the clerk can confirm this, in the procedural bylaw, if you move reconsideration at a future meeting, like I did with Memorial Center School, you need 2/3 majority.
Yes.
So you wouldn't be, if there was one person missing, it wouldn't make a difference to the vote.
Yes, okay. So
unless
in that
there's
sense,
3 people missing, right?
Right. So in that sense, the possibility of this going bad or going rogue seems very low for that simple reason that you need that supermajority at later times.
The only time it would be in play is if it's in the same meeting.
I think so now. On reflection, that does appear to be that appears to be correct.
So we're going to go back to the clerk's original wording, which is just who is absent from the vote. Is that what you want? Okay. So can we get that wording up so that we can vote on it? Be made by a member of council who voted on the prevailing side of the decision, proposed for reconsideration, and this is the addition, or who was absent from the vote. Okay. Need the screen back up so I can see everybody's face. Oh, Mr. Clerk has a comment. Go ahead.
Ian, can you put that motion back up again? I think we're missing one word. It should say may only be made. So insert the word only before be made.
May only be made was the original wording. Okay, so that's the amendment. Everyone has spoken. I'll call the question. All those in favor? All those opposed? That motion fails on a tie. Okay. So where were we? So that was the amendment. So we're back to the main motion. It is the committee format, so there can be multiple rounds, but we were on the first round. So who has not spoken on the first round of debate that would like to speak? Mr. Vice Chair, will you take the floor or take the chair?
I do.
Okay, thank you. I kind of anticipated this, not the particular amendment, but that we would have an amendment that would be, that might split the committee or that would be a non-unanimous vote, right? I suspect this may happen on some of the aspects of this bylaw, that we wouldn't have unanimity, but what we need is consensus. And so what we just did there was we spent an hour on amendment or 45 minutes on an amendment that didn't advance our cause at all. It's not going to council and it disappears. It just, it was an attempt to improve the bylaw that did not result in anything. And even if it had passed here 4-2, it could have failed at council and wasted even more time, or to use the expression, not that it was wasted because it was informative. What did we learn from that amendment attempt was that this is a challenging process, amending things here at committee, which is kind of what I was saying at the beginning, and why I prepared an amendment that does not actually change the wording of the bylaw, but suggests that we examine certain aspects of the bylaw that we know to be, that we know would generate debate at council. And we need to know what council thinks about those items before we vote on the bylaw. That's essentially my amendment. So I'm asking, the amendment is not fully crafted. I have a wording, but it can be added to, because I've included in the wording a list of so far the six aspects of the proposed bylaw that have generated discussion here tonight, and questions and lack of consensus or lack of agreement on some level, or the anticipation of needing to explain ourselves a little bit further in the open session. So, Madam Clerk, I sent that to you by email. Do you have my motion, which was seconded by Councillor Chappelle? Okay. So, Mr. Vice Chair, this is my motion. I'm going to, it's a little bit long, so I'll just sum it up again. The first part is just saying before we go ahead, because the recommendation is to present the amended bylaw. Before we do that, we resolve into committee of the whole to discuss the following aspects. And now this is not meant to be a complete list. So if you guys have any other aspects of the proposed bylaw you want to add, now would be a great time to do that. You'll see the first one is the one we just had an amendment about. And they're kind of written in chronological order of when they came up in the questions and debate today. The second one is rules for debate on deferral motions. You'll see the list there. These are all the things that were already have been identified. And then number 7 is any other aspect as determined by a member of council that has not already been examined. So why committee of the whole? Because just like at committee, you get multiple rounds and a more informal discussion that allows for more wholesome debate. And why committee of the whole, and why not just this committee, is because the consensus of all of council is what is needed before we craft this bylaw. And because there's so many different aspects that are in contention, we don't really want to examine any specific amendments until we know what the will of council is. So if we discuss the rules around a motion to reconsider, like we just did briefly here with this amendment, we would be able to tell from the discussion if an amendment, and we do this all the time at council, amendments come up when someone on council realizes that they have the votes for an amendment to pass, and the amendment is helpful. And that's what I'm proposing we do at committee of the whole. There's nothing in this wording that mentions amendments, but we all know that that's the way that you make changes to a bylaw. So that's my proposal, and thank you for considering it.
Thank you, Councillor Stroud. So we have a mover and a seconder. I'm wondering if we could have the wording back up, and for the sake of anyone that's watching that may have visual impairment, I'll just read the 7 points. Councillor Stroud did a good job of summarizing the intent, but I think it's worth just stating them very clearly. So it's an amendment to have council resolve itself into the committee of the whole to discuss the following important aspects of the proposed amended bylaw clause by clause. 1, the rules around a motion to reconsider. 2, rules for debate on deferral motions. 3, amending the committee bylaw to require all committee deferrals to go automatically to the committee's governing body for a decision. 4, the posting of communications from member of council on the public agenda. 5, rules around electronic meetings and the 6-month extension for virtual meetings past the state of emergency. 6, the option for attending in-person meetings electronically. 7, any other aspect as determined by a member of council that has not already been examined. So it's on the floor. Would anyone like to speak to it? Ask staff questions about it? Going once. Twice. Seeing no one else, Councillor Stroud, the floor goes back to you.
Yeah, so this basically what this does is kind of defers the theoretical proposed amendments that we might come up with back to its proper location, which is at council. And it fulfills the council direction to give them advice on how to deal with this item. How does it improve the thinking for council? Well, it has a list of already identified possible sources of an amendment, but not necessarily. For example, the posting of communications for members of council on the public agenda might not be that controversial, but maybe it needs to be explained because it's a new thing, right? So it gives us the chance to go around and ask questions about what that means, because it isn't clear from the wording in what circumstances that particular one would be used. So this moves the debate back to its rightful place, and it suggests that council do it in committee of the whole. And of course, it would be council's decision whether or not to go this route once it gets there.
Excellent, thank you. So we'll take it to a vote. All those in favor? Oh, Mr. Clerk, before we vote, sorry, Mr. Clerk, I see your hand up.
Mr. Acting Chair, my apologies for jumping in. Just to be clear and to provide openness and transparency with the proposed recommendation, we would actually quote the amendment that was approved at the last meeting so that members of the public would know what as amended really means. And so the council will also know that as well. So in terms of housekeeping, we would just introduce that amendment that was approved by committee through Councilor McLaren at the last meeting. So you would see it a little larger than what you see there. That's all.
All right, and I believe that would be agreeable to the mover. Councilor Stroud, I think you have
yeah. So
on that.
Yeah, before we go any further, so that as amended in its entirety, and then after that, after that spot, you would add the amendment from the previous meeting at that point.
To Mr. Vice Chair, it's important for openness and transparency to record what that amendment was, so that when it gets into the council agenda, public and council will understand that the committee did review this to some degree, and they also approved an amendment to the bylaw in addition to those additional matters which they would like council to focus on when they debate that in committee of the whole, should this recommendation pass.
Is that agreeable, Councillor Stroud?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's anything that is the most transparent is always the best.
All right, so hearing that, we will call a vote. All those and opposed, and that passes unanimously. And I'll return the chair to you.
Thank you. So no one thought of anything from the draft bylaw that wasn't mentioned in my motion, but now would be the time to think of any other improvements that we could suggest. Yes, Councilor Sharon?
I was going to suggest that on section 11.10, letter D be added, and not on any substantial issue, because this was an issue that was raised by closed meeting investigator, where we were told that we shouldn't be making substantial decisions in camera, and it should be codified just because that's the law.
So
here, I'll start and then Ms. Morley will jump in. That is actually redundant. As you know, we cannot deal with substantive motions in closed session, but I'll let Ms. Morley address that as well.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I note that the Municipal Act does prohibit the taking of any vote in closed session, except for in the specific circumstances that we've identified in section 11.10. So the amendment wouldn't be necessary as it's already prohibited by the Municipal Act.
There are lots of things that are prohibited by the Municipal Act that are reinforced at a local level, and I would suspect that this should be one of them as well.
Okay, well, are you proposing an amendment, Councillor?
No, this is, you had asked a question as to if there's anything else So I'm happy to have suggested something else. But I don't think there's an appetite for that at this meeting.
Okay. Does anyone else wish to speak? Councillor Schwell.
The passing of this motion would suggest or refer to me that with the exception of the items that we're pulling out, that the good work that the clerk has done in clarifying and quantifying all of the amendments into an orderly fashion is something that this committee as a whole agrees to or accepts. Is that my misunderstanding, or is that my general understanding is correct in that regard?
Through Mr. Chair, that was a working document to allow the committee to assist them in their deliberations. It's, for all intents and purposes, it's information only. I would add that, the committee's already made a decision on the report. There really isn't anything left on the agenda to discuss except for adjournment.
So procedurally, Madam Clerk, the motion that passed included reference to the recommendation. The recommendation was that the draft bylaw be presented to council for all three readings. And the recommendation is now that prior to doing that, they resolve from committee the whole to discuss those points. The reference to the motion is there. So what does that mean to the recommendation? Like, what will it look like in the report to council?
I'll answer. So, Mr. Chair, you've moved the motion of deferral so that those two items as amended and some other substantive areas are going to council for their consideration. I don't anticipate that we will be bringing forward any bylaws at the subsequent meeting unless council were to make the decision that they want to approve those bylaws. At that point, we'd introduce those bylaws. But I don't anticipate placing any bylaws on the committee council agenda dealing with this matter.
So so if I may, Mr. Clerk, the discussion would happen at, well, first of all, the council would have to vote on the recommendation. If the council passes the recommendation, they resolve in committee of the whole and discuss those aspects. Amendments to the draft bylaw wouldn't be in order because there wouldn't be a draft bylaw to amend. Is that what you're saying?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct. We will not be placing any bylaws specifically with respect to the procedural bylaw or committee bylaw on the agenda. The idea is, should council accept the committee recommendation, we would probably have to call a special council meeting in committee of the whole to deal with this. I don't suspect that we would be doing this next Tuesday. However, if council should give opinion that they're happy with the bylaw as amended, then we would introduce the bylaws at the meeting. Ultimately, once again, it's council's decision on what they want to do with the committee recommendation.
You bring up a valid point. So the final aspect that isn't covered by the motion is the timing of the committee of the whole discussion.
Correct.
Do we want to recommend anything from the committee, or do we want to let council? I'm assuming council's not stupid. That council will figure out that they're going to need to discuss time and pace, whether it's a special meeting or as part of a regular meeting, and probably in consultation with the clerks to see what's on the agenda.
Absolutely. Mr. Chair, that will be in consultation with us and council to pick a date where we could have the meeting. Obviously, it would be a shocker just to put that for next Tuesday, given our simple debate for the last 2.5 hours on pretty much one amendment. So, yeah, I would leave it with council to make that decision on when they, as a group, can meet, as opposed to directing them to meet at a different date. That just doesn't seem fair.
Okay, so the clerk is saying we don't need to discuss timing, and I'm not seeing anyone with their hand up. So I guess that is at the end of the item. The item's been dealt with. We've made a recommendation to council. There's no other items. So at this point, we go down the agenda. All these empty items to motions, notices of motions, other business, correspondence. Usually these are all empty in a special meeting. And then don't forget, we're meeting on Thursday. And for our regular meeting, which ironically will probably be a shorter meeting than the special meeting was. So I'm looking for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Chappelle, Councillor McLaren, all those in favor? And that carries. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much for your decorum.